What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite factions from Warhammer 40k. So, a few years back, when the announcement for Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, the video game, was made, I didn't really know anything at all about Warhammer, but having previously really enjoyed the game's developer, Owlcat Games' work, I knew I wanted to learn more about it so I could properly enjoy it when it released, and that took me on a journey learning all about it, basically with just the intention of playing that game, but I've since played a whole bunch of other games and obviously done a bunch of my own research here and there that made for a really nice journey of me both discovering something that was already really well established and finding some appreciation for it, but also just to some really great video game experiences. And that's something that's been on my mind as I've recently been playing Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, and we've even got some more Rogue Trader DLC coming out later this month, so I thought it might be fun to make a video like this. Now, with that in mind, I don't particularly claim to be the absolute most singularly knowledgeable person about the setting, as I've only been at it for a couple of years, and the original version of the game, really, was released all the way back in 1987. But with that context in mind, let's talk about some of the factions that, as somebody who just fairly recently got into the setting overall, enjoyed the most, and why. Now, we're going to kick this list off with the absolute most vain appreciation on my end, and that is Khorne's Blood Legions. The chaos god of violence and martial honor, but mostly just mindless violence. The Blood Legions are his, obviously, main legions made out of his demon hosts. But the reason I like these guys is just pure visuals. I think they look incredible. A lot of them really remind me of those Frank Frazetta paintings. And between that, and of course all the skull imagery that is present all throughout the setting, but here especially, has always just been some of my favorite personal imagery when it comes to this kind of art. Not sure if you've seen the channel logo, but I'm a big fan of skulls, which works out pretty well when you're simply seeking blood for the blood god and skulls for the skull throne. Again, though, most of what I enjoy here is just purely visual. Otherwise, I think the Blood Legions and everything, and just the mindless violence and whatnot, is a little restricting in terms of like storytelling and whatnot. But as one of the myriad of factions in this setting, I think it works out just fine. But that does bring me to my next entry. Fourth from the bottom, we have the Adeptus Mechanicus. So as somebody who runs a PC gaming related channel, you may just be aware of the fact that that kind of inherently comes with a certain degree of love for PCs and technology in general. So something like the Adeptus Mechanicus, which takes all of that love for engineering and science and technology, but then puts a weird religious spin on it, I think is really, really cool. Throw in their penchant for replacing every part of their body or their weak flesh with proper steel and mechanical parts to allow them to better commune with machine spirits, as they call them, alongside outfitting themselves for war, not to mention their integral role to the Imperium of Man, maintaining all of their advanced technology, which puts them in a somewhat delicate position when it comes to upholding their own beliefs and reconciling that with the faith of the rest of the Imperium, as sort of two sides of the same coin. Makes for this really interesting faction that is also very, I would say, human in nature, if that makes sense, where effectively these two forces that would otherwise be opposed are reconciling those differences in viewpoints for the sake of mutual benefit, which becomes this sort of weird dance of politics between the two, and it's a really fun way to engage with something, but also while still making it cool as hell. And visually, I also think it's one of the more striking elements of the setting as well, especially when you get into those huge robots and machinery like Titans. And none of that even touches all of the history behind the Adeptus Mechanicus and how it used to be the cult Mechanicus before reconciling under the Imperium. But it's definitely one of the cooler factions as far as I'm concerned. Now that does bring us to number 3 though. 3 is the Necrons. Another faction with a really cool bit of background and lore, but realistically, the thing I enjoy about the Necrons the most is that in a setting that is as strange and out there as Warhammer 40k can be, Necrons somehow manage to my mind, seem the most alien, despite still having roots in, of course, I would say modern-day ancient civilizations. Like, obviously, ancient Egypt is a big inspiration there. But the Necrons here were at one time the rulers of everything in the galaxy basically, before taking a very long stasis nap, only to wake up and find all of their holdings overrun by all sorts of creatures that might as well be ants as far as they're concerned, because the Necrons, I would say realistically, are the most powerful faction. They're simply not at full force because most of them are still waking up from their tombs. You can't even really kill the ones that are here. You can only sort of temporarily disable them before they're teleported away by their own technology, because their bodies were long since discarded for the sake of this regenerative metal that also seems to have stripped them of emotion or feeling, allowing them to not even enjoy the immortality that they've obtained. And then you have all that really compelling background stuff with their wars against the star gods and how they ultimately turned those star gods into weapons at their disposal. But like I said, ultimately, I just really enjoy these guys because of how alien they seem in comparison to even the other literal aliens here, which is always an attention grabber. But that does bring us to number 2, and this is the Tyranids. I really enjoy the Tyranids, and that is somewhat because in learning about Warhammer 40k, I was able to put some pieces of a puzzle together that I didn't even realize was happening in the background, because I used to play a lot of StarCraft. If you're familiar with StarCraft at all, you're probably aware of the Zerg. And from what I understand, the Zerg are not only based on the Tyranids, but were actually developed initially as part of some canceled 40k game back in the 90s. But I have only really heard of that as a rumor. I honestly don't have any real proof of that. But the connections are obvious, and then the Tyranids themselves are based on the works of H.R. Geiger and the Xenomorphs, of course, so it's all kind of loosely related, and it was kind of cool to make all those connections with the Tyranids. But one of the reasons they're on this list and why I enjoy them so much is just realistically because of how, I would say, terrifying they are in comparison to everything else in this setting, which is more understandable, let's say. The Tyranids are simply mindless, awful destruction in some of the most gruesome ways possible. And what's more, while they often work in these ridiculous swarms overtaking planets and devouring them before moving on like locusts, they're all technically one organism. They all collectively have a consciousness referred to as the hive mind. And this hive mind really only concerns itself with its own survival. There's really not much else behind it besides a sort of all-consuming hunger. But this hive mind is also psychic energy, so things like the psychers and sorcerers of this universe really can't even stand up to these guys because the sheer psychic might of the hive mind kills them instantly in most cases, if not just drives them insane. However, that psychic energy and the lack of a desire to do anything besides feed also renders the Tyranids basically immune to a lot of the corruption of the warp and chaos that is prevalent everywhere else, which might have something to do with the fact that Tyranids are from a different galaxy. They come from beyond the void and aren't native to this little section of space. And then you blend all of that with just, good old-fashioned body horror and the incredibly interesting stuff with the gene stealer cults that prep planets for the arrival of the hive fleets, and you've got an incredibly compelling faction as far as I'm concerned, which is what they're doing so high up on this list. But then we have my number 1 entry, the faction I genuinely enjoy the most, and that is actually the Word Bearers of the Heretic Astartes. So when I was initially learning about Warhammer 40k, a lot of people recommended that you start with the Horus Heresy, as it's a really big setting and everything to get into. There's just a ton to know. And the Horus Heresy sets up a lot of the modern stuff as a decent place to jump in and start learning. And doing pretty much exactly that led me to the Word Bearers, one of the Space Marine legions that turned against the Emperor of Mankind back when he was a living, walking person before being trapped and confined to his throne following a fight with Horus at the end of the Horus Heresy. But the reason the Word Bearers turned against the Emperor was just an incredible bit of storytelling that really drew me in. In fact, it was probably the moment at which I was researching Warhammer 40k where I was like, oh wow, I'm super into this. And I had to read basically everything about this moment. And the reason I enjoyed it so much is that, again, while the inherent things happening in the story are obviously very bombastic and sci-fi in nature, let's say, it all has like a hint of real humanity to it, because the Word Bearers turned against the Emperor for basically love turning into hate. They worshipped the Emperor as a god, which is something he himself did not want, and they were publicly reprimanded, let's say, to put it extremely mildly, which turned their leader Lorgar to the forces of chaos. And it's just a very compelling human story about someone admiring someone else to the point that those feelings turn into hatred. And that corruption is shown further in the goal of the Word Bearers even now. They basically turn the Imperial Creed on its head and simply spread heresy in the disguise of religion at the same time. But you combine those elements of just real things humans go through with some incredibly compelling visuals. Again, really love the art style for a lot of that stuff. And you've got my favorite faction of bad guys, which is saying something in an entire universe beset by and filled with a whole lot of bad guys. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it entertaining. I would love to know what your favorite factions in this particular universe are. I admit sometimes it can be hard to delineate between little sub-factions of a much larger faction, as oftentimes each of these very large individual factions are divided up into a lot of smaller, tinier factions, so there's plenty of room to elaborate is what I'm saying, so I'd definitely love to read some of that down in the comments sections below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.